Hi, and welcome to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. I'm your host, and today in studio we're joined by Pandy Pridemore from the Human Resource USA and Karl Ulrich from Sebaly, Shillito Dyer. They're here to talk to us about background checks. Pandy?
How are you, Britt?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Karl?
Hi, Britt.
Hey. So why would we need a background check? Why on earth would we ever need to background check anyone for employment?
That is a fabulous question. And only the company can answer that. Okay. There is no requirement on a federal and state level to require that any company do a background check. So when they're deciding or even discussing whether they want to do a background check, they have to do it for all the right reasons for their company and the job that they're performing for their customers or clients.
Okay, so does it depend on the industry more so? So you have obviously people from the financial world, you know, almost all of them are background checked and fingerprinted and the like, but you also have people that are, say, you know, janitors, you know, the people that work for cleaning companies many times are background checked because they're going to be in people's, you know, businesses or homes with their personal information or personal, you know, effects and the like.
And notice what you just said. You were talking more specifically about the job that they were going to be doing and the interaction they were going to have within the setting of the client or the customer. Background checks and credit checks are not meant to prove an individual's qualifications, their competencies, or their skill sets. That's a whole separate conversation. Background checks and credit checks are to determine whether an individual is appropriate for a position.
Okay.
So identifying what that individual is going to be doing and the individuals they're going to be working with or interacting with, the responsibilities that individual is going to have, the risk of not having a background check for that particular individual, that's what they need to be focused on. And when I talk about they, that's the business owner, that's the management team. Those are decision makers, not lower level supervisors. This is higher level.
Okay. Now, do you think, Karl, with these times that we live in, is it prudent for most companies to consider doing background checks just to kind of protect their employees or protect themselves from maybe future litigation in case they do bring someone on that, you know, has a criminal history that perhaps, you know, ends up committing a crime against somebody in the company? I mean, is there liability there?
I think yes. I think it's very prudent, and it's becoming more and more common in my experience. I mean, when you make a bad hire, it's expensive. When you make a mistake in the hiring process, it's expensive. So at a minimum, background checks can, I think, reduce some of that risk. If you're able to get good information, you can make more intelligent hiring decisions. But quite apart from that, there are liability concerns. If you are in a position where you're presenting yourself to customers in a particular way, you're making representations, or you're selling security, and you're selling quality, and you're selling honesty and integrity, and you make a bad hiring decision, sometimes that can result in problems with your customers and ultimately result in liability for you. So understanding the needs of your particular business and developing a background check process within your hiring system itself is really important.
So I hear ads all the time on the radio that talk about, you know, this heating and air conditioning company or this cleaning firm, a background check, you know, technicians, you know, were safe, reliable, and all that sort of thing. So especially if you're advertising that you've done this sort of thing, it would be important that you're actually doing it, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what happens if, I've heard from some folks in the industry that say, you know, sometimes companies try to skimp on the background check, and maybe they only do the background check in the 1 or 2 counties that their business is located in, and not necessarily, you know, a national background check. So someone might not have been convicted of anything in this county or the county next to it, but perhaps in two states over, they did have a conviction. Do they have any kind of liability for doing, you know, kind of a shoddy job on the background checks?
Yes, and part of the challenge here is that there isn't a common language in the background check industry always about what product you're getting for the price you're paying.
Right.
You don't always know if the background check that's being advertised is a comprehensive one or if it's selected to certain areas. And so understanding really what you're getting for your dollar is extremely important. A national background check may not be what you think it is. Mm-hmm. A national background check may just be a check into federal conviction records. but not cover any of the convictions at the state level, which is where most of the criminal background issues arise. And so you may not be getting what you think you're getting. And so it's really important to be talking with your vendor, finding out what it is that they're actually going to be doing when you pay that invoice, what it is exactly they're going to be delivering to you, and where that information comes from.
So is it safe to say that you probably ought to just make sure it's as comprehensive as possible and be consistent across the board? If you're going to background check, one employee, obviously background check all of them. Pandy,
Oh my goodness.
Pandy, can I pick and choose or anything?
No, you cannot pick and choose. If you do one, you've got to do them all. And it's interesting. I was just at a client this week who background checks on a regular basis. They're a manufacturing firm, and yet they just hired a new CFO and did not do a background check on him.
Because he had some big title.
He had some big title. He came from these big companies, and I was dumbfounded as to, okay, so let's talk about the risk and liability there. What does he have access to? What is appropriate for that position? Well, somebody who isn't going to run away with all their banking numbers and write checks, on a fraud base. You have to go all the way across the board. It doesn't matter if they're C-suite. You have to go all the way across the board.
That would make sense to me, and to me it would make sense if I'm a business owner that I try to get as reasonably priced and as comprehensive of a check as possible. I mean, for me, I'm in the financial industry, and I've had in order to get an NMLS license to do loans and that sort of thing, it's required by the government to be fingerprinted and background checked to be to work in the lending world.
Let's go a little bit further on that. Remember, background checks can also include credit checks.
Okay.
So determining whether a credit check is appropriate for a position, would you necessarily need a credit check on somebody who's doing, doing the dishes in a restaurant versus somebody who's a CFO?
Right.
So, that's another determination. Don't spend money on something you don't necessarily need.
Yeah.
Be very specific on how you're going to use that information and who you're going to get it on.
Now, speaking of that, I've seen more and more industries and companies utilizing credit. As you know, I do a lot of talks on credit around town, and more companies are using credit reports, even for non-credit related occupations, or non-financial occupations, that they've been using credit as an indicator of character. Is that something
Go
that
to
you
Facebook if you want to know character. Why go for a credit check and spend the money? Go to Facebook.
Yeah.
Go ahead and.
Yeah, I have difficulty with that approach too.
Yeah. I mean, because I don't buy into that. I mean, but I've heard that if you have rough credit, that somehow that's an indicator that somehow you're going to do your job poorly.
It's a lot of people use that as a benchmark of reliability of if you can keep your own financial house in order, you can do a good job. There may be circumstances, there may be specific positions where understanding someone's credit history is useful, is a valid issue, and in a CFO position that may be something to consider. But the run-of-the-mill, line worker, the person who is running the machines, who's getting the widgets out the door, is that necessarily a problem? I don't know that it is. There are other things, I think, which in those positions might be far more important to know. They have a violence history, domestic violence, assault and battery, that kind of thing. Are they they have a history of drug abuse? Those kinds of things may be more pertinent to certain types of positions than others. So, again, I think that and the scope, the geographical look, how widely you cast your net for information may also depend to some extent on the position that you're looking at. You're hiring for a national sales position. Obviously, you want to be a little more broad in your casting out for information in that situation than you would for someone who is going to be driving a taxi cab in Columbus or something like that. So again, you do have to, I think, as I said earlier, define your goals, understand what your needs are, define your goals, and then develop a background check strategy around that.
Okay. Now, you brought up something about our drug tests also kind of in this realm of background?
I'm going to let you face it.
Yeah, I would say drug tests are part of the hiring process. It's a little different from the background check per se, because I think background check provides you with certain types of information about a person's maybe credit history, maybe their criminal background, their education, their training, whatever. But a drug test is more focused on that person's condition today. And are they in a position, are they in a condition right now where they can come to work, they're going to be present, they're going to be safe. They're going to be qualified, and that's a part of, I think, can be an important component to the hiring process, but it's in addition to, I think, the typical background check that I would see.
Well,
Because-
let's distinguish too. Background checks and credit checks are governed under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is also overseen by Title VII. So what they were actually, the whole concept between the Fair Credit Reporting Act is to remind employees and candidates that they have certain rights. So they can't be discriminated against because of certain things that have happened in their lives. Yeah. So that helps differentiate the difference between drug tests and background checks and how the information's used.
Okay. You know, I had a conversation with some folks that worked for a union, and they were talking about they were in construction, and they were talking about how difficult it was for them to find workers that could pass the drug test. Yeah. Because marijuana has become so much of a prevalent, drug of use, and they said they were thinking about actually kind of not making that a drug that would disqualify them for working for the union. Yeah. What do you see happening with that as that becomes?
That's another whole show,
approved for
Britt.
medicinal reasons.
That's another whole show.
Another show. Okay.
That's another whole show. Yeah, because again, with medical marijuana and the shortage of certain individuals and qualifications for certain jobs, yeah, we're hearing
Totally.
A lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm thinking of my 18-year-old son. I mean, he applied for a job last year when he was 17 to pack boxes for a company, and they made him do a drug test.
Right, but marijuana is being used by individuals that even our contemporaries are using it. So
Yeah.
there's no certain demographic that you can pin out to say those are the drug users. So that's another whole show.
Okay, well, we'll do that in the future. We'll talk about.
Yeah, this is good. We
drug
just
tests.
moved from one to the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, getting back to the background checks. So we've talked about, there's a requirement that you would want to be, consistent with who you would background check everyone.
Yes.
Are there any other reasons why we would, a company would, for sure want to, make it a practice if they're not doing it now?
No, this is just to, again, get a feel for the type of individuals that are appropriate for the type of services that they provide. But let's talk about something else that needs to be determined when they're deciding, okay, we do want to do a background check or a credit check, whichever you want to call it. I think it's extremely essential that the company establish a policy of how they're going to use that information, who's going to maintain it and control it. And with that means that they have to literally research and make sure they understand the state laws and the federal laws around that, because I've got companies that I go into and they're a felony done, no consideration. Yeah. They did this, no consideration done. And that's where they're starting to make their big mistakes. I mean, we've talked about getting the proper paperwork and getting the waivers and getting all of those disclosures done. Those will come with the background check company, and that's not a policy. That is not the policy. The policy is how is the company going to use this information to decide who gets employed and who doesn't. Right. So that's where Karl sees the biggest problems, I'm sure.
That's great information. Now we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this.
Marie, you have prediabetes.
Prediabetes? I don't have time to eat right or exercise. I'm a busy mom.
Oh, you're a busy mom.
Yeah.
This is great news. Busy moms never get prediabetes.
Wait, what?
Let me just... Yeah, this is all the people at risk for prediabetes, and way over here, busy moms. No?
Hart, what's going on?
I'm leaving.
Why? What did I do?
Not enough. You constantly ignore me. You barely eat anything healthy. You're half as active as you used to be. The pressure is just too much. I quit.
Okay, I get it. I'll do better. Just please, don't leave.
Okay. But remember, if I go, you go.
Listen to your heart. Don't let it quit on you. Uncontrolled high blood pressure could lead to stroke, heart attack, or death. Get yours to a healthy range before it's too late.
Welcome back to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. We've been talking with Karl Ulrich and Pandy Pridemore about background checks. Now, we've been talking about background checks and when to do them, but once we do these background checks, Karl and Pandy, what do we do with the information?
Well, you know, this is a very sensitive time. I love this part of it because I keep putting emphasis, or I want to keep putting emphasis on the fact that it should have limited scope as to who has it. We need to really control this information. So there are even guidelines on where this information is kept once you have it.
You can't just keep it in the personnel file?
No, okay. I do not want it in the personnel file. Remember, it's to protect and maintain individuals' rights to employment. So the Title VII is to keep individuals from being discriminated against. And if the wrong information gets to the wrong person, someone who doesn't have a need to know, there's a good chance that a judgment could be made.
Okay.
And they'll place judgment. So if you're working with a background check company that maintains records electronically, keep them electronic.
Okay.
Don't print them out. Just leave them on there. And if the HR person is the one who's collecting it, if it's the owner that's collecting it, make a decision, yes or no. And Karl will explain a little bit more how to make that decision, but maintaining the information has got to be very tight.
Okay. So if there's a felony that shows up, can you have a policy that says all felonies automatic disqualified?
You can, and many employers do. In Ohio, for example, there are not very many restrictions on how you can use background check information. So, for example, you could, as an employer, say if anybody has a felony conviction within 7 years or 10 years or something like that, that's an automatic disqualifier. That's certainly permissible. The question really is whether that suits your needs, whether that's consistent with the needs of the business, the needs of the particular positions in question. So when you establish that rule, you need to follow it, you need to be consistent, and it needs probably to make sense when it comes to who you're hiring and for what positions. Some states, unlike Ohio, do prevent employers from going back and utilizing conviction records beyond a certain point in time, older than, say, 7 years in some places. So depending on where you are, you have to be aware that the rules may vary.
Okay. So that kind of protects somebody that does something really stupid when they're 18, and then 30 years down the road,
Some person, we've all done stupid things when we were
Yeah,
18.
exactly.
21, 23.
Yeah, I mean, but where they got convicted,
Oh, well.
maybe they were hooked up with the wrong crowd, and it was a drug conviction, or maybe they even had to do some prison time or something like that. But they're now 48 years old, and and they have a long history of of good being of good behavior and no more trouble and that sort of thing. Maybe even references that say their character is is excellent and that sort of thing. Right. So those situations where maybe a company wouldn't necessarily utilize a conviction from that long ago.
Well, even DUIs.
Yes.
I mean,
they're very common.
DUIs are very, very common, but is that applicable to what the individual is going to be doing? And
yeah,
do
if you don't
use
drive
that as
for the company.
Are you going to use that as a criteria? You're almost controlling the personal life as much as you want to control the professional life when you're making these kind of decisions. So you really have to look at all things that are added up into it. And that's why I said policies are, you really need to have a legal policy. This is not a policy that the company itself can just write up. This is a policy that truly has to have some legal oversight to it. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. And the classic example that I utilize is the chief financial officer. You're hiring somebody for a CFO position. Mm-hmm. They had a marijuana possession conviction, misdemeanor marijuana possession back in their college days, 20, 25 years ago. Is that going to be a factor? Are you going to consider that as a disqualifier perhaps in your hiring of the CFO now? Mm-hmm. What if, on the other hand, they had a bank fraud conviction or they were kiting checks 10 years ago? Would that be pertinent to the hiring of a CFO today? Those are two very different situations. And so when you set the parameters, how are you going to use the information you get? I think it makes sense to consider the position you're hiring for, the time frame you're going to be looking at, and the kinds of disqualifiers, the kinds of convictions. Are we going to concentrate only on felonies? Are we going to concentrate on felonies and misdemeanors? Or are we only going to concentrate on certain types of felonies that are pertinent to the job in question? So again, these are all things I think that need to be said ahead of time, and you can work with your provider, your vendor, your background check company in setting some of those parameters up when they do the actual checks.
Yeah, and there's also, I've seen situations where, I'm familiar with the licensing process in the lending world. People have to get a background check and they have to take a test and take a class and the like. And one of the SAFE Act for that the lending world has to comply with to get people licensed, they do have a cutoff of, if you've had a felony within the last 7 years, you're disqualified at all. And if any of those felonies had anything to do with financial, with theft of money or money laundering, that's an automatic disqualification ever. You could never get the license ever. So there are some cases where I've seen, what you were just talking about as far as a time period.
Right.
I also saw a situation where a gentleman was, he was in a county where if someone calls regarding a domestic situation, that if the police come to their house, pretty much somebody has to go to jail. And they basically, he got arrested for domestic violence, even though there was no, there was no battering or anything like that.
Right.
But he almost didn't get his license because, he had to explain that situation.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because this is another thing that I catch every so often when I'm doing audits at a company. The application, the employment application, is a great place to make your first mistake when it comes to background checks and this question, the conversation. The language required or allowed, let me say, on an application in regards to whether an individual has committed a felony has changed. So if you have not updated, or if a company hasn't updated their employment application in the past, I would say 3 years, 4 years maybe, you need to really look at it. You can no longer just ask, have you ever been committed of a felony?
Okay.
So
that's what I was going to ask, the wording, because
Yeah.
if it says, have you ever, or if it says within the last 7 years, or, they have to kind of be more specific, Carl?
Well, you actually in Ohio still can ask that question if you're a private employer.
Okay.
The rules have changed with respect to public employers in that questionnaire. Okay. But I will say, and Pandy's right, the rules are changing, and depending on where you are, other states have gone even further than Ohio has, and some are restricting those kinds of questions in applications presented by private employers. So that is a movement that has has gathered a lot of steam over the past, say, 5-7 years, and a decade ago we wouldn't be talking about it. Now it's happened, and it's expanding rapidly. So you need to be aware of that. I would again, I think most of the vendors and if you work with a payroll company or if you work with an attorney, you probably want to be making sure that those applications are compliant, because you may run into problems, particularly outside of this state.
And that's crazy, because most companies aren't looking at their applications.
Oh, no.
They
They
don't
just kinda
think that
use
any
one.
laws are going to be governing that particular tool that they're using. And while we're on that subject, getting back maybe even to more the hiring process, but background checks are not to be taken for most positions when you take the employment application.
Okay.
And I still catch that every so often, where they're just sliding that in, plus the drug test. So you fill out the employment application, you complete the background check paperwork, and you're collecting a release for the drug test. That's not good timing.
Okay.
We talked about
should
this
that
during the
timing-
offer letter.
What should that timing look
After
like?
the offer has been extended. Now, there are some very particular positions where, yes, we do kind of have to check the background check early, but not so early that we're discriminating against individuals prior to even deciding whether we want to employ them or not. Okay. So we need to be kind of careful about that flow of information. Remember, it's a decision in the employment decision or the offer, so it's pending and contingent on a successful completion.
Okay.
But you definitely don't want to do that prior to, and weed out your individuals that way.
Now, what about companies that actually specifically try to reach out to hire folks with criminal backgrounds? Or is there any liability on their part, or do you see any potential challenges? Because I know many folks that they did something, they got convicted, they went to prison, they did their time, and now they're trying to reintegrate into society, and they're obviously you need to have employment, and there's some companies out there that that they actually try to give people a second chance, and they're trying to specifically try to help get those folks get employment. Are there any issues with that?
Well, first of all, let me say I think that's a wonderful program. I think getting people into the workforce, giving them a second chance, giving them an opportunity to prove themselves, I think is a wonderful thing. And I encourage more employers to think about doing that, because I think there's an awful lot of untapped potential out there. Having said that, I think you also have certain challenges and certain risks associated with that. And I think with a proper vetting procedure, with the appropriate interview and vetting and precautionary measures, I think you can probably reduce any risk substantially. So, I mean, no hire is without some risk, no matter who you're hiring, right? And so you just have to, I think, go into a process knowing how you're going to approach it, and when dealing with more at-risk populations, with more at-risk candidates, you just probably have to develop a little more in-depth screening process.
Okay. And if I know that I'm primarily hiring somebody for, say, a driving position, obviously part of the background check many times is a driving record check.
Especially if it's a DOT.
Yeah. So, like we were talking about taxi drivers, obviously they're going to be, or what about Uber and things like that? What does Uber do for that? You see all these folks, they're independent contractors for Uber, but
I honestly don't know.
I would assume they run that.
I think they do have a background check process, but I don't know what it is.
I hope, because I use that all the time. I hope they do.
There was an example of, I guess, somebody getting, somebody being attacked by a driver somewhere. I mean, obviously, like you said, you could have somebody, even that nothing shows up in a background check, that somebody could still do something bad.
Oh, sure.
So it's not a foolproof, thing. But yeah, that would be interesting. But we just ran in that one county. They were good there, but
Yeah, no, don't make me think about it.
All right. Well, what are some of the final thoughts that maybe an employer needs to be, thinking about with regard to background checks in our final minutes here?
Well, I'd come back to a couple things. I think you want to first identify what your needs are. What is it that you're really after in an employee? What are the kinds of things, kinds of skills that you're looking for, and what are your risk factors? What are the concerns that you have? Is it honesty? Is it maintaining a safe workplace? Is it a combination of all of those things? And then you need to upfront design a series of parameters around your background check process. What areas are you going to be looking at? Are you going to be doing a national search for a particular position, or are you going to be focusing on statewide or countywide? What types of disqualifiers? What are the disqualifiers? What information will disqualify an individual from employment if you get it back? Set that up in advance and document the fact that you set those parameters up, and then apply them consistently. So a lot of the homework, a lot of the risk avoidance occurs even before you start the hiring process, I think.
Now, once they're hired and they're working for us, we did the background check, we did all this stuff, but then they get convicted after they're employed. Are there, and maybe you know about it and maybe you don't.
Well, that's separate than the background check. Remember, they're employed now, so now they're under company policies.
Okay.
And that can be handled entirely up to the company.
Agreed. Agreed.
Okay. This is great information. Pandy, Karl, employers really need to pay attention to this. This is something that obviously could get them in a lot of trouble if they're, using the information in the wrong way,
yes,
or, just not doing it at all, because, again, you bring somebody in, there's a big, safety issue.
Hire a CFO, get a background and credit check.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've been watching Business Talk.